Hello everyone, welcome back. My name is Dominic and today we're going to talk about getting started with Maya. And this is part one of a series of videos that I'm putting together that kind of take us through Maya and get us started with 3D modeling, look development, and working our way up to rigging and animation, and of course rendering with RenderMan. So stay tuned for more of that stuff, but as a part one of this video, we're just going to be talking about opening up Maya, getting used to the controls, getting used to how things are going to work. And should be especially helpful for folks who have never opened up Maya before, or perhaps are getting acclimated from it from another 3D software program such as Unreal or Blender. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, when you launch Maya, and this is Maya 2023, although 2024 and 2025 look pretty much identical as of this video, you'll be hit with the library screen, which we're looking at right here. So a couple of things going on that we're just going to talk about, but we're going to move on afterwards. In the middle, we've got our recent projects. Now, if this is the first time that you're opening up Maya, this will be empty for you, and it'll ask if you are new and experienced. That won't necessarily matter. It'll just give you kind of available tutorials from Autodesk themselves, which are really, really useful. To the left side, we have our current project setting. We'll cover this in a little bit. But let's go ahead and start a new project, and we can just go up to this top left icon called New, and let's click on that. And now we'll be hit with the overall general Maya workspace. So a couple of things to note here, and we'll just work our way from top left all the way to bottom right. And we're just going to talk about really quickly some of the basic tools, shelves, workspaces that we can use in Maya. So Maya is a very cumulative program, and it can do so much for us, and it's one of the reasons why a lot of folks use it. Now, up at the top, up at the top left, we've got our file, edit, create, modify, all of these different toolbars with drop downs that we can navigate a bunch of different tools, commands, and settings. We also have this area right here. It's currently highlighted as effects, but we can change this, and what this is this is essentially a shelf workspace that we can use for different parts of 3D animation. So for now, I'm going to switch this from effects, which are VFX, visual effects, over to modeling. And now you can see my drop-down menus have changed to give me a lot of 3D modeling centric tools, commands, and things like that. On top of that, you also have workspace presets over in the top right, which for right now it's set at general, but we can change this to any of these options that we've got over here. So, and this is getting ahead of it, but if you are looking for a workspace that has a whole bunch of UV editing tools, you can go ahead and scroll down and switch this to UV editing, and now you've got your UV editor, you've got your UV toolkit over there at the far right. And so this just kind of makes it handy where if you're at a different part of the pipeline working in Maya, you can switch your workspace to one of these, and you can have a lot of the tools already available in your workspace, in your UI, which is kind of nice. But I'm going to leave it on general for now. Most of the times I work personally in general, and I just like to open up those toolkits and things like that whenever I run into them. So the very first drop down that we'll talk about is File, which is right over here. File just allows you to manage your project settings, to create a new project, to set your project, as well as to open any recent projects that you've had. You can also import or export stuff that you're working on. So for example, if you have created or downloaded or have gotten a 3D model from somewhere else, you can import that through this import button. You can also export whatever you've been working on by going down to export all or export selection. So it's pretty self-explanatory. Other things are these really nice kind of export project settings for Unreal and for Unity if you're working towards a game engine, but we won't cover into that today. This is very important. Save scene means that you save this particular scene or document. Save scene as, if this is the first time that you're saving this particular document, you do want to hit save scene as, so that way you can tell it where you want it to save, as well as what file name you want it to save under. So very important right there. If you have saved a scene and you want to go grab it again, you can go to open scene, and you can find in a directory where that particular scene is. However, if you want to start a brand new open document like this, then you can just hit File, New Scene, and it'll give you a nice blank document for you to save and continue working and build something up. So that's what we've got over here. One final thing to note is set project. This is important if you're working with a lot of different assets and maybe you're putting together a scene. Maybe you've got characters and an environment and you want everything to be stored within one project library, one project folder. You do need to set a project to do though. So for me, I'm using this folder called the VDev rig, and I will hit set. Notice that I'm grabbing the folder itself because if it's the first time that you're setting a project, it will create a bunch of folders inside that directory for you to store textures, for you to store rendered images, for you to store different scenes. So if you have multiple assets, it'll make all of that for you all in one nice neat little library that you can go back and grab it from. So that's some of the stuff in the file dropdown. We can talk more about other things as we start running into them, but we'll just quickly move left to right. Edit just has a lot of clerical commands such as cut, copy, and paste. You can delete stuff. You can delete history, which we'll talk about more later. You can duplicate objects. I should note to the right of all of these commands, you will see the hotkeys that are provided for it. These are default, but you can always change your own hotkeys and customize it. And you'll also notice as we continue going through, there are these little squares to the right of each of these commands. And if you click on them, there are settings that you can change and customize for fulfilling these different commands. So for example, duplicate special, you can click on that box to the right of it and you can change how you want an object to be duplicated. If you want it to be duplicated more than just one copy, you can change that. If you want them to translate down a specific axis, you could do that as well. There's a lot of stuff that you could do within each of these commands. So it's not just one command. You can customize each command to do specific things for you. So let's go ahead and move on. Select has a lot of stuff that's regarding 3D sculpting and stuff like that. Hierarchy is very important for rigging, but of course you can say select all, deselect all. You can do some other stuff like that as well. We can move on. Modify has a lot of stuff for, let's say, conversions. So if we want to convert curves to surfaces or polygon edges to curve, we can go down to one of these convert options and you've got a lot of that stuff here for you. We also have align and snap tools. These are pretty handy tools for getting stuff to stick on other objects. If you're putting rivets on a metal plate, for example, you can do a lot of that stuff. You can also change your center pivot, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So quickly moving on, display shows you what will be displayed in your current viewport, and you can change if you want to see things in wireframe, if you want to see things shaded. There's some other things that we can talk about here, but it just gives you all of the commands in one drop-down. Windows, same deal. These are editors, so if we go over to one of these editors, we can find very specific settings for all of the different tools that Maya has. And we also have our settings and preferences tab over here. So if we need to, we can go ahead and change the overall general settings of Maya itself. Something important to note is the plugin manager right here under Windows Settings and Preferences Plugin Manager. If you are using, let's say, a rendering plugin like Pixar RenderMan, you will need to add that in by clicking on this plugin manager, which is its own window. And you can type in, let's say, RenderMan, and make sure that it is loaded and that it automatically loads every time you launch Maya. So if you have other, let's say, Python scripts or other plugins that you've gotten online or that you've built, this is where you can activate them and make sure that they load in every time. So those are the general drop-downs that we have offered to us by Maya. Everything else kind of past that is going to be specific on whether you are in a specific workspace or for specific tool sets. So right now I'm in modeling, so the next drop-downs that I have are specific to 3D modeling. Now let's talk about moving around and kind of changing our viewport, because of course we are in a 3D modeling software or 3D animation software, so we've got the ability to see all three axes. Now those axes are indicated right here in the bottom left. We of course have X, Y, and Z. They are color-coded to kind of help you distinguish one from the other. And up here at the top right, we also have a cube that indicates kind of which section or which direction we are looking at the center of our viewport. So The center of our space is indicated by this grid right here. This is almost like a flat ground plane that we get to start working with. And we can see on these darker lines, the center of the space itself, 0, 0, 0, right? And that means that the distance of x is 0, distance of y is 0, distance of z is 0. So that is the center of my space. And when I'm modeling, I like to keep a lot of stuff in the center until I'm done and move it off. But I won't get too far ahead in that. So if I look at this cube, I can actually click and drag on that cube and move my scene around so I can look at the space or at the document or whatever I'm working on at different angles. And the cube also indicates whether I'm looking at the front, the top view, the right side, the bottom, the left side, etc. Now, there's a couple different ways on how we can move around and how we can look around and tumble and zoom and pan and do all of that stuff. So let's go ahead and get started with that. What you're going to want to do is hold down the Alt key, left click and hold, and this allows you to tumble. So we're kind of walking around the center of our document, or whatever we have kind of focused on, and this is how I can look at objects from different angles. Now if I also hold down Alt and instead of left click middle mouse button, I can pan, and this means I'm translating my viewport or my camera, let's say left to right. I can also use the middle mouse button to scroll up and down, to zoom in and to zoom out. If you want a little bit more specific kind of incremental zoom in or zoom out, you can also Alt right click and you can click and drag to go in or out as you zoom. So Alt is our main, there we go, viewport manipulation tool right there. So going back up to our drop downs, right underneath them we have what are called shelves, and shelves are kind of icons of commands and tools that we've got at our disposal that are conveniently placed all in one shelf that we can use depending on what we're trying to do. So you can see these by these rows of icons right here. The very first one that you start off with is curves/surfaces. So these are tools for, let's say, drawing curves, manipulating, simplifying curves, and then you also have tools such as creating what we call NURBS surfaces. So NURBS cubes, NURBS cylinders, other NURBS primitives, sweeps, booleans, extrusions, and things like that. Now the main shelf that we will be using, and probably the one that it defaults to, is this second shelf called Polymodeling. Polymodeling has a bunch of icons, a bunch of different tools that you can use at your disposal, such as adding primitives for us to get started working with in 3D modeling, such as this cube. And when we click on it, we get a cube right there in the center. It also has cylinders, cones, toruses, things like that, planes for if you need to make something like a ground plane. Those are all available up there as well. Now, we'll have more videos covering through more of what each of these tools are, but it's important to note that all of these tools come in very, very handy depending on which part of the process that you're in. So if you are 3D modeling, you're going to be spending a lot of time in the polymodeling shelf. However, if you are sculpting, then you may want these sculpting tools available for you as well. Same thing goes for rigging, such as creating skeleton, constraints, binding skin, animation, time graph, graph editor, things like that. Rendering, this one I don't necessarily use, and we won't get really into it because we're going to be using RenderMan for our rendering software for this video series. VFX, right? VFX caching, MASH, which is procedural kind of modeling and instancing, motion graphics, XGen, which we won't really be using since there are better tools like Houdini out there, and then of course RenderMan 26.3, which is the current version of RenderMan that I'm using, which has of course rendering tools such as creating lights and of course rendering. So those are where the shelves are located. So depending on which area of the pipeline that you're working on in your project, you will be able to navigate to one of these shelves that may better fit the tools that you're looking for and have some of those tools conveniently ready and at your disposal. Now, underneath that, we have our viewport settings, which is just at the very, very top of our viewport box. So these settings control what we see in the center of our viewport. If we go to view, we can, of course, cycle through multiple cameras. We can align our camera to specific objects. We can change our, if we have moved our camera, then we can undo or redo those view changes, and etc. Shading, this allows you to see other things such as your wireframes, backface culling, that's one that's kind of nice if you're working on interior environments, and a couple of other things. Lighting, we can turn this on so that way we can see form and cast shadows if we do have lights set up in our stage. Renderer, if you're using RenderMan, you will have that as an option, or let's say Arnold, but currently it's showing Viewport 2.0, which is just the normal viewport. And then finally, panels. This is where you can kind of go into other cameras that you have selected by going to perspective, which in my case, I have no other cameras. You can also switch to orthographic views, such as the front, the side, the top view. And you can see that change right there. Other things that are kind of nifty are these two last ones, tear off copy. Sometimes if I want to see two different windows or two different viewports, maybe one through my camera and one in perspective, so that way I don't accidentally work or change the view of my camera, I can hit tear off copy, and now I've got a new window that's essentially the same right here. Something else that you can do is you can hit the space bar while your cursor is in the viewport, and you will be able to see all four viewports, your 3 orthographic and your 1 perspective, right in front of you, so you can see the front view, the side view, top view, things like that. You can also hold the spacebar down to get a bunch of different settings that we won't get into too far today, but if you left click and hold, you can also change your viewport based on what these are saying. So if I want to go to front view, I just need to pull my cursor down and release, or if I need to go back to perspective view, I can pull up and release. So that's another kind of nifty way of how to navigate through it. Now, underneath these drop-down menus for the viewport settings, we also have a bunch of other small icons. These guys are tiny, but they can also be helpful for us as well. So if we start kind of going left to right, I'm just going to start about right here because this is where some of the more basic, the more fundamental settings are. So the first one that we're going to talk about is this little checker right here. This is the grid, and if I click on that, it toggles the grid on and off of the ground plane. So that's really handy as well. As we go on through, if you have a camera, you can mess with these. This will show a resolution gate depending on the resolution that you have set up for that particular camera. In my case, I don't have a camera, so it's not too useful. If we keep moving forward, we've got all of these different settings right here. If I click on wireframe, then I will not be able to see my object in shaded mode, but instead I will see the wireframe skeleton of my cube. And I can toggle that on and off. If it's not on there, then you can have it set to smooth shade, which is the next icon right here. And we can keep moving on. Default material, if you do have materials assigned onto this, then it will toggle this back and forth between that and the default material of normal Maya primitives, which is just Lambert 1. You can also turn on textures if you've added textures into your scenes, that way you could see them. And then later on, if you have lights, you can turn on shadows and ambient occlusions. That way you kind of give a little bit of depth, and it kind of makes your viewport a little bit easier to see everything. Perhaps my favorite setting is this guy right here, which is called anti-aliasing. And if I turn this on, you can notice that the resolution of this particular viewport gets a little bit more crisp. And I do like that. So it's a little bit less pixelated, and I turn that on just as a quality of life benefit for myself. We're going to move on from these. We'll cover these a little bit later, but essentially you just have different exposures for your camera settings if you want to manipulate those a little bit differently, and then of course your image color space, which right now is just set as ACES standard RGB. So with the viewport out of the way, we have a couple other things that we can talk about. This is the outliner to the left side. This is almost like a table of contents. So the more stuff that you add in, the more stuff that you manipulate, you will be able to see a list of all of that in your outliner. So if I have multiple cubes, then you can see now I've got cube 1 and cube 2. You can also see if I group these two cubes together, they are now known as group 1, and there's a plus sign to the left of it. If I click on that, it can expand, so that way I can still grab those individual groups. So this is showing geometry, but the outliner also shows everything else that you add in. You can change and toggle what you want the outliner to display or to show based on those two drop downs up there. And if your outliner is gone, this icon right here at the very far left is how you can toggle it back and forth. I should also note, instead of hitting spacebar, you can also change your viewport to, for example, your orthographic views by doing the same thing. Up here we've got selection tools. So if you have, let's say, a lot of faces on these guys that you want to grab, you can change your normal selection tool from just grabbing one face or perhaps a series of faces. You can also use the paint select tool, and this creates almost like a paintbrush that everything it touches will select those faces, and it just kind of gives you a little bit more that you can use. So we won't really dive in too much into that. I should also note, if you have, let's say, this cube again, we can use some of these same commands or some of the same settings up here on our keyboard as hotkeys. So if I hit 1 or 2 or 3, you'll be able to see smooth preview mode to rigid mode on your viewport. So in smooth preview mode, this gives you the illusion that there is more geometry than there really is showing right now. And so with this cube and 6 faces on it, if we were to subdivide it and put it in smooth preview mode, it would look a little bit more spherical as it averages out kind of the curvature of a cube. So that's really nifty, and everything that we want to make, we want to have at least some semblance of curvature on it to keep it from looking very mechanical like it does right now. Other things to note, if we hit 4, we can put our viewport in wireframe mode very quickly, and if we hit 5, we can put it in shaded mode very quickly. There are more hotkeys that we're not going to talk about just yet, so I'm going to leave it at that. Now on the very far right side, we have our attribute editor, which is right over here. These have a bunch of settings for whatever is selected. In my case, it is this cube. So if we click on pCube1, we will be able to see the translate, rotate, scale settings or attributes that we can modify. So if we want to, we can enter in an actual number in this box and move our object, let's say, on the x-axis 1 unit, and you can see it has shifted 1 unit based on that grid over. You can also enter in negative numbers, so it goes the other way. You can also do everything the same. You can change the scale. If you want the scale to not be uniform, you just have to enter numbers that are not equal to each other, and now this is half the width of its length and of its height. Moving on, you also have, in this case, since we started with the cube, you have polycube 1. This is a natural kind of setting that you can manipulate. So if you want extra subdivisions inside your cube, you can dial these guys up or down. You can also change the width right here. But I'm going to leave that guy alone. Initial shading group, when you start to attach shaders or shader groups such as Pixar surfaces, this is where you'll be able to see everything kind of hook up and connect to. In this case, the shader group that is affecting my cube is Lambert1, and that you'll also see in the attribute editor to the right is this guy. And so here you can change, for example, the color of my Lambert1. You can change its transparency, so it looks a little bit more opaque or more transparent depending on what you're looking for. I don't necessarily mess with these because ultimately they don't render in RenderMan, so they will be replaced with Pixar surfaces, but it's kind of nifty if you're modeling something that you just kind of want to see everything grouped into a color or, etc., things like that. So it can be a useful tool for your workflow. Now, other things that you'll see in this kind of area besides the attribute editor can be your channel box / layer editor. This has a lot of the same stuff as the polycube attribute editor inside the attribute editor has. But essentially, this is just kind of everything lined up right here for you. Other things that you will have are render settings, in your channel box settings that you can select whether they are going to render in RenderMan or not. We won't get into that stuff for this particular video. So as you keep opening up editors, it's very common that you'll find them along the very, very far right side. So if you're working in XGen, then your XGen toolbar will be there, your modeling toolbar will be there. If you have a UV editor, it'll show up there. Those are where all the editors show up on the right side of your UI. Now on the bottom we've got this slider right here. This is our time graph. So this indicates frames showing in sequence of each other. So if we had objects in motion, then we can key, for example, this particular cube at this frame, and we can slide it down, and let's say 100 frames later, it translates back here. And now we've got objects that move within time. Now, this video we're not going to talk about how to key things and how to animate things, but that is where it's going to be found. You can change how many frames are displayed underneath right here, which right now it's set at 240 frames. And you can also change the FPS, or the frames per second of the duration of your animation. So 24 frames per second for 240 frames. This shows me a 10-second clip that, since nothing's moving, you won't see any changes, but you can also hit the play button and it will go through at 24 frames a second. So that's what the bottom half is, with our time graph and some animation tools that we've got over there. So stay tuned for the next video where we talk about what we can do with this particular cube, how we can modify it, how we can move it, translate it, rotate it, scale it, do a bunch of different things like that. We're also going to talk about manipulating or changing the different faces, the different edges, the different vertices of this cube, and adding more geometry onto this, so that way we can get something more sophisticated, more complex, and maybe by assembling a bunch of complex objects or a bunch of complex cubes, we can make something way more complex, like a figure, like an object, or any other asset that we've got to 3D model. So that's coming along down the pipe. If you found this video helpful, please let me know. If you have any questions, throw it in the comments. But until then, I'll catch you guys next time. Thank you again. Bye-bye.